The countryside stretched wide and silent, bathed in the golden glow of the summer sun. A silver luxury sedan sat motionless on the roadside, its hood propped open, steam escaping into the humid air. Inside, Thomas Winfield adjusted his tie, his movements sharp with irritation. He glanced at his phone again, the words "no signal" glaring back at him, mocking his frustration. Thomas Winfield was not a man accustomed to obstacles. At 78 years old, he had built a life of success and comfort. His wealth had paved the way for convenience, turning problems into minor inconveniences solved with a single phone call. But here, on this lonely road, with no service and no help in sight, he found himself stranded, stripped of the control he so carefully maintained. His hand reached for a neatly folded handkerchief, which he dabbed against his forehead. The heat of the day pressed heavily around him, the air thick and stifling. As his gaze wandered down the empty stretch of road, a faint noise broke the stillness. A metallic rattle carried on the breeze. At first, he dismissed it, but the sound grew louder, steadier, until a figure emerged on the horizon. It was a boy, riding an old battered bicycle that seemed to protest with every rotation of its wheels. He was small, no more than 14, with a wiry frame and a calm determination that belonged to someone much older. The boy approached, his gaze shifting between the car and its well-dressed owner. His clothes were faded, his sneakers scuffed, and a small toolbox was strapped to the back of his bike. He slowed to a stop, setting his bike carefully against the roadside, and slung the toolbox over his shoulder. "Flat tire or radiator trouble, sir?" The boy's voice was steady, polite, as though this encounter was an ordinary part of his day. Thomas hesitated. He wasn't used to strangers addressing him so directly, let alone offering assistance without prompting. He cleared his throat and gestured toward the hood of the car. "It's the radiator, I think. Overheated." The boy nodded once, his eyes scanning the engine as he stepped closer. Without hesitation, he opened the toolbox and pulled out a pair of gloves that had clearly seen years of use. The boy worked quietly, his hands moving with practiced precision. He inspected the hoses, tested the connections, and wiped his brow with the back of his arm. Thomas watched in silence, torn between skepticism and awe. This child, with his worn shoes and modest tools, worked with a competence that rivaled any professional Thomas had ever hired. "The radiator's leaking," the boy finally said. His voice carried no hint of worry, only certainty. "I've got some sealant here. It should hold until you can get to a shop." He retrieved a small bottle from his toolbox and applied the sealant with care, tightening clamps and ensuring everything was secure. For several minutes, the boy worked, his focus unbroken. Thomas stood by, still unsure of what to say. Finally, the boy stepped back, brushing his hands on his jeans. "That should do it," he said with a small smile. "Just add some water to the radiator and take it slow. You'll be fine." Thomas nodded, his movements slow, almost uncertain. He retrieved a bottle of water from the car and poured it carefully into the radiator. As the boy packed up his tools, Thomas reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet. He flipped through the crisp bills, pulling one out and holding it toward the boy. "Here," he said, his tone more firm now. "Take this, you've earned it." The boy paused, his gaze falling briefly on the outstretched bill before meeting Thomas's eyes. He shook his head and raised a hand. "No, thank you, sir," the boy replied. "I don't need anything, just happy to help." For a moment, Thomas was speechless. The boy's words, simple and without hesitation, carried a weight he hadn't expected. Thomas lowered the bill, slipping it back into his wallet as the boy hoisted his toolbox onto his shoulder. Without another word, the boy returned to his bike, climbed onto the seat, and began pedaling away. His figure grew smaller and smaller, swallowed by the vast expanse of the countryside. Thomas stood there, rooted in place, his gaze fixed on the retreating figure. For the rest of his drive, the boy's words echoed in his mind. In a world where every service had a price, this boy had shown him something entirely different. A selflessness that couldn't be bought. That day, Thomas Winfield left with more than a repaired radiator. He left with a moment of humility, a lesson delivered not by a business partner or an associate, but by a boy with nothing but his skill and his heart. As the evening descended, Thomas Winfield's car pulled into the sweeping driveway of his estate. The grandeur of the house loomed before him, with its tall columns, immaculate gardens, and flawless symmetry. A fortress of success built over decades. Inside, the silence was thick, broken only by the soft ticking of an ornate grandfather clock in the hall. The walls were adorned with artwork worth millions, the furnishings elegant and refined. Thomas moved through the space, his footsteps echoing faintly on the polished floors. He entered his study, a room of dark wood and rich leather, where a glass of whiskey waited untouched on the desk. Thomas sank into the chair, his gaze falling on the crystal-clear liquid. Around him were the symbols of a life well lived, shelves lined with leather-bound books, framed achievements, and photos of long-forgotten moments. Yet tonight, these objects felt hollow, their significance diminished by a single encounter on a dusty road. The boy's words played over in his mind. "I don't need anything, just happy to help." The morning sun rose slowly over the rolling hills, casting soft light on the fields and winding country roads. Thomas Winfield, seated in his silver car, gripped the steering wheel with a quiet determination. The memory of the boy on the bicycle, with his steady hands and simple words, lingered in his mind like an unfinished story. He didn't fully understand why, but he knew he had to find the boy. Perhaps it was gratitude, perhaps guilt, or maybe something deeper, a need to understand how someone with so little could carry himself with such dignity. Thomas drove the same road as the day before, scanning the horizon for any sign of the boy. At small diners and gas stations, he stopped to ask about him, describing the boy as best he could. Young, maybe 14, dark hair carrying a toolbox. He helped me with my car yesterday. Most shook their heads or offered polite shrugs, but finally, at a roadside cafe, an older woman wiping tables paused and looked up. "That sounds like Jaylen," she said, her voice carrying both warmth and curiosity. "He's always helping people around here, lives with his mother in Stanton over near the edge of town." Thomas repeated the name softly, committing it to memory. Jaylen. He thanked the woman and continued his drive, the road narrowing as it wove into a quieter part of the countryside. Stanton was a modest community, with small homes lined neatly along unpaved streets. The town had a quiet charm, the kind of place where neighbors waved and children played in the yards. As he asked for directions, locals directed him to a small house near the edge of town. "That's Clara Robinson's boy you're looking for," one man said. "Good kid, always fixing something." Thomas approached the house slowly, parking on the gravel drive. The house was simple, with peeling paint and a porch that sagged slightly under its weight. Yet the yard was tidy, the curtains drawn neatly, and the flowers in the small garden bloomed brightly against the worn backdrop. Thomas sat in his car for a moment, gathering his thoughts. Then, with a deep breath, he stepped out and approached the door, knocking lightly. After a moment, the door opened to reveal a woman in her early 40s. Her face was kind but tired, her eyes sharp with curiosity as they studied the older man standing on her porch. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone polite but guarded. "Good morning," Thomas began, clearing his throat. I'm sorry to bother you, but I believe I met your son yesterday. Jaylen, right? He helped me with my car." The woman's expression softened immediately, a small smile forming at the corners of her mouth. "That sounds like my Jaylen," she said, pride evident in her voice. "He's always helping folks." "I just wanted to thank him properly," Thomas said, his voice quieter now. "He wouldn't accept anything from me yesterday, and I couldn't stop thinking about it." She nodded, stepping aside to let him in. "He's out back, fixing the fence. You're welcome to wait." Inside the house, the air carried the scent of freshly baked bread, mingling with the warmth of the small but inviting space. The furniture was old but clean, the walls adorned with family photos and drawings clearly made by a younger Jaylen. Thomas noticed the pride and care in every corner, a stark contrast to the cold perfection of his own home. The woman led him through the house and out to the backyard, where Jaylen knelt beside a section of wooden fence, hammer in hand. His movements were careful and deliberate, his focus unwavering. "Jaylen," the woman called gently. The boy looked up, surprised to see Thomas standing there. "Hey, mister," Jaylen said, wiping his hands on his jeans. "What are you doing here?" Thomas hesitated for a moment, unsure how to explain himself. "I wanted to thank you again," he said finally, his voice sincere. "You helped me when I really needed it, and I haven't been able to stop thinking about it." Jaylen shrugged, his expression easy and unassuming. "It wasn't a big deal, just something I could do." Thomas glanced around the yard, taking in the patched fence, the uneven grass, and the weathered swing set leaning in the corner. It was clear the family didn't have much, yet there was an undeniable warmth to the space, a sense of resilience and pride. "You've got a good head on your shoulders," Thomas said, his voice steady. "Your mother must be proud." Jaylen grinned, glancing back toward the house. "She works hard. I just try to help out where I can." Thomas stood silently for a moment, absorbing the simplicity of the boy's words. He thought of his own childhood, growing up in a house not unlike this one. Memories of his parents, their tireless efforts to provide a better life, flooded his mind. Finally, he spoke, his voice softer now. "I'd like to do something for you and your family." Jaylen straightened, his expression cautious. "We're okay, mister. We don't need anything." Thomas's gaze didn't waver. "It's not about need," he said gently. "It's about what's right. You helped me, and I'd like to return the favor." Thomas made the promise that day, and he intended to keep it. The next morning, contractors arrived at the Robinson home, and the quiet street came alive with the sounds of hammers, saws, and chatter. Jaylen and his mother watched from the porch in disbelief as the workers replaced the sagging porch, repaired the roof, and cleared the yard to make way for something new. "I don't understand," Clara Robinson said, her voice trembling. "Why would you do all this for us?" Thomas turned to her, his expression sincere. "Because you've done something far greater. You've raised a son who reminded me of what really matters." Jaylen stood beside his mother, his gaze focused on the transformation unfolding before him. Though initially hesitant, he began to ask questions, watching the workers closely, fascinated by their skill. For Thomas, this wasn't just a project, it was a new beginning for both the boy and himself. The following morning, the quiet of the Robinson household was broken by the hum of trucks and the sounds of hammers. Contractors moved with purpose, unloading supplies and surveying the worn house that was about to be transformed. Jaylen stood on the porch, his toolbox in hand, watching in stunned silence. His mother, Clara, stood beside him, her arms crossed over her chest, her expression a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. "What's all this?" she asked, her voice tinged with a quiet tremor. Thomas Winfield stood at the base of the porch steps, clipboard in hand, directing workers with an ease that only years of leadership could provide. He turned toward Clara, his expression warm but firm. "This is just to thank you," he said simply. "Your son helped me when I needed it most. I couldn't leave without doing something in return." Clara shook her head slightly, glancing at the bustling workers. "We've always managed fine on our own." Thomas nodded, his tone steady. "I know you have. That's part of why I wanted to do this. You've built something here, something more valuable than I could ever buy, but I think you deserve a little help, just like your son thought I did." Jalen stepped forward, his curiosity breaking through his initial caution. His eyes darted between the workers, the new lumber being carried to the house and the tools being unloaded from the trucks. "You're really doing all this for us?" he asked, his voice steady but tinged with awe. Thomas smiled, crouching slightly to meet Jalen's eyes. "I am, and it's not just for you, it's for me too. Your kindness reminded me of what I'd forgotten. Now it's my turn to show up." Over the next few weeks, the Robinson house transformed. The sagging porch was rebuilt with sturdy, polished wood. The roof, once patched and weathered, was replaced entirely. Inside, the faded walls were freshly painted, the old kitchen updated with modern appliances, and the creaky floors refinished to a warm glow. The yard, once uneven and sparse, was cleared and leveled. A brand new swing set was installed in the back, its chains gleaming in the sunlight. Neighbors stopped by to watch the progress, their admiration growing with every passing day. Jalen, despite Thomas's insistence that he take a break, couldn't help but join the workers. His curiosity was uncontainable, and his hands itched to learn. One of the workers, a burly man named Joe, noticed the boy's eagerness and handed him a tape measure. "Here," Joe said with a grin. "Measure this plank for me. Let's see how sharp you are." Jalen's face lit up as he took the tape measure, carefully marking the wood. By the end of the day, he was asking detailed questions about construction, soaking up knowledge like a sponge. Thomas watched from a distance, his heart swelling with pride. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of purpose that went beyond boardrooms and business deals. The evening sun cast a warm glow over the finished house. Neighbors gathered in the yard, marveling at the transformation. Children played on the new swing set, their laughter echoing through the air. Inside, the house gleamed. The mismatched furniture had been lovingly restored, and the kitchen smelled of fresh bread and roasted vegetables. Clara Robinson stood on the porch, her eyes glistening as she looked out at the scene. Thomas stood beside her, his posture relaxed but his gaze introspective. "You didn't just fix a house," Clara said softly. "You've given us something I don't know how to repay." Thomas shook his head, his voice equally soft. "There's nothing to repay. You've already given me more than I realized I needed." Jalen joined them on the porch, his face thoughtful. His voice was quiet but deliberate as he spoke. "Mr. Winfield, I've been thinking about what you've done for us. I want to do something like this one day, help people the way you've helped us." Thomas smiled, placing a hand on Jalen's shoulder. "You already are, Jalen. It's your kindness that set all of this in motion. Don't ever lose that." The three of them stood together, watching the neighborhood come alive with laughter and warmth. The house, now bright and strong, wasn't just a building anymore. It was a home filled with connection and gratitude. In the weeks that followed, Thomas found himself returning to Stanton regularly. What had begun as a gesture of gratitude became something far greater. He arranged for Jalen to shadow the workers who had renovated the house, giving the boy the opportunity to develop his passion for construction. Jalen's curiosity blossomed into a dream. He began sketching designs in a notebook, imagining projects that could improve the lives of others in his community. Clara watched with pride as her son's confidence grew, his potential unfolding before her eyes. For Thomas, these visits became more than just trips. They became homecomings. The Robinsons welcomed him as family, their warmth filling a void he hadn't realized was there. The story came full circle on a quiet stretch of road. A young man rode along the same path where he had once met Thomas, his bicycle now well-maintained, his toolbox still strapped securely to the back. Jalen stopped beside a car pulled over with its hood open, steam rising faintly. Without hesitation, he dismounted, slinging the toolbox over his shoulder as he approached. "Flat tire or radiator trouble?" he asked, his voice steady and confident. And in the distance, a silver sedan paused on the road. Thomas Winfield sat inside, watching with a proud smile as the young man carried on the lesson he had taught so long ago. Sometimes, the smallest acts of kindness ripple into something far greater. For Jaylen and Thomas, a chance encounter became the foundation of something extraordinary. And in the end, they both learned the same truth. The greatest wealth lies not in what you have, but in what you give.